floodplain, cypress forest, and interconnected waterways that shift and change year to year in ways that make any map you print off before a trip essentially decorative. People have been working this swamp for generations, fishing, trapping, hunting, and the ones who know it well know it the way a person knows a neighborhood. They know which channels run in dry season. They know which tupelo groves flood first. They know where things are, and more importantly, they know when things have been moved. Dale Thibodeau was 51 years old when this happened. He'd been running trap lines in the Atchafalaya since he was old enough to go out with his uncle, and he'd been running his own line since his late 20s. He operated in a section of the lower basin that most commercial fishermen avoided because the access was difficult and the channels were shallow and unpredictable. Dale preferred it that way. He'd worked this specific stretch of swamp for more than a decade. He knew every stump and every water line, and he knew his traps the way a farmer knows his fence posts. In the spring of the year this happened, Dale began finding his traps in the wrong position. Now, traps get moved. That's not unusual. Bycatch animals disturb them. Flood pulse shifts the debris around them. Occasionally another trapper, less scrupulous, relocates one. Dale knew all of this and accounted for it in his routine. He'd seen all of those scenarios many times. This was different. The traps weren't being displaced. They were being relocated with a purpose. Specifically, they were being moved to positions that were less effective. Each time Dale went out and found a misplaced trap, it had been moved from a productive location to a shallower, less trafficked area, where it would catch little or nothing. The relocation was consistent, always moved in the direction of the main channel, always placed slightly out of the current where things moved. The traps were full of water and weeds and nothing else. After the third time this happened in the same week, Dale understood that this wasn't animal interference, and it wasn't random drift. Someone was going out ahead of him and moving his equipment, on purpose, moving it specifically to reduce what he caught. He told his wife about it that evening. She asked if he thought it was a rival trapper. He said he didn't think so, because a rival would either take the traps or leave them. They wouldn't have any reason to just move them to less productive water. Moving them took time and knowledge. Whoever was doing it had to know the water well enough to identify which positions were productive and which weren't. The following week, Dale started arriving earlier. He left the dock before 4 in the morning and ran his lines by headlamp, and on the third day of doing this, he found something he hadn't expected. His traps had been moved again, but this time he was early enough that the morning hadn't settled. The water was still flat, and in the soft mud along the bank of the secondary channel where 2 of his traps had been relocated there were footprints, human footprints, bare feet going by the shape of them, large, wide, the kind of print that spreads when it carries weight. And beside the prints, an indentation in the mud that Dale said looked like a long pole had been rested there, the kind of push pole you use to move a flat-bottomed boat through shallow water. He crouched there in the dark with his headlamp off, listening. The swamp was going about its business around him. Frogs, insects, the occasional soft splash of something moving in the water. Nothing that sounded like a person. Nothing that sounded like a boat engine or a pole working through current. But the prints were fresh. The water hadn't had time to soften the edges. Whoever had moved his traps that morning had been here within the last hour. Dale told the story in parts, over a period of months, to a local journalist who was doing a feature on traditional basin trappers. By the time he told it in full, he'd had months to think about it, and what he said was that the print discovery was when the thing stopped being an annoyance and became something else. Something that he couldn't quite name, but that changed how he felt about going out alone. He started carrying his grandfather's .357 on his hip when he ran lines. He'd never felt the need to do that before. Over the following 2 months, he found evidence of habitation, not all at once, piece by piece, spread across a wide section of the basin. A fire pit in a hollow cypress trunk, used regularly enough that the soot was layered in distinct burns. A cache of supplies wrapped in oilcloth and wedged into a split in a downed log above the waterline. Canned goods mostly, along with a folding knife, a box of matches sealed in a plastic bag, and a small hand-drawn map that Dale described as showing a section of the basin that he recognized, but that was annotated in a way he didn't understand. with marks that appeared to indicate where certain boats passed and when. A lean-to structure barely large enough for one person, built low against a levee bank under a canopy of swamp tupelo, constructed from materials that included both natural deadfall and salvaged wood. The kind of wood that comes from structures not from the swamp. Someone was living out there, not camping, living, maintaining a functional existence in the deep basin, off any grid, off any map, off any record. Dale reported what he'd found to the Iberville Parish Sheriff's Office. He walked them through the evidence across 3 separate trips into the basin. The investigation that followed involved the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, the Army Corps of Engineers, which has jurisdiction over portions of the basin, and eventually the Iberville Parish Sheriff's Criminal Division. What they found, over several weeks of coordinated searching, was a habitation pattern that extended across approximately 12 square miles of the lower basin. Multiple caches, multiple lean-to structures at different points, used in apparent rotation. The map Dale had found was one of several. There were at least 4 others recovered from different cache sites, and together they created a detailed picture of boat traffic patterns, water access points, and law enforcement patrol routes in that section of the basin. The individual was identified as Robert Mace, 63, a former commercial fisherman who had been reported missing by his adult daughter 4 years earlier. His truck had been found at a boat launch outside Butte La Rose. The working assumption at the time had been that he'd gone out on the water and had an accident. 4 years. His family had spent 4 years assuming he was dead. Robert Mace was located by a wildlife and fisheries officer on a routine patrol in a section of the basin about 6 miles from Dale's trap lines. He was in good physical condition, which investigators found remarkable given the circumstances and the time involved. He did not resist. He came off the water without incident. He told investigators that he had chosen to leave, that the life he'd had before had become something he needed to put down, and that the basin was the only place he'd ever felt like he understood what he was doing. He'd been living on fish, game, and occasional supply runs on foot to a rural gas station near the basin's eastern edge, where he paid in cash and spoke to no one more than necessary. He was not charged with any criminal offense. His presence in the basin, legally, was a complex question given the overlapping jurisdictions, and ultimately no charges were pursued. His daughter was contacted. Dale was notified. Dale said in the journalist's final piece that he respected the choice, that there were days on the water when he understood it better than he could explain. But he also said that the footprints in the mud in the dark, the fresh-edged prints beside the push-pole indentation while the night was still around him, he said that image didn't leave him easy, even after he knew what it was, even after it had an explanation. He said the knowing almost made it stranger, not simpler, because that meant someone had been out there all along, watching his boat come and go, watching him run lines, watching him the way you watch something you've decided you're going to be careful about, for months before the first trap was ever moved. And the moving of the traps, Dale eventually concluded, was probably a message, not an aggressive one, more like, I'm here, I've been here, I know your rhythms better than you know mine, be aware of that. Story 2. The Boards. Okefenokee Swamp, Georgia-Florida border. The Okefenokee is one of the oldest swamps in North America. It sits right on the Georgia-Florida border. It covers more than 700 square miles, and it is, by any reasonable measure, genuinely primeval. The black water in the Okefenokee gets its color from tannins leached from the vegetation, and it's so dark in some channels that you can't see more than a few inches below the surface. The swamp produces its own peat from accumulated plant matter, and that peat floats in sections, entire islands of vegetation, trembling underfoot, which is where the Seminole name comes from. Okefenokee means land of trembling earth. Wildlife biologist Adrienne Cole had been working in the Okefenokee for 3 years when this happened. She was doing population surveys on wood storks, a federally protected species that nests in the swamp, and her work took her into sections of the refuge that saw almost no visitor traffic. She knew the place well, the way you know somewhere after 3 years of paddling into it 4 and 5 days a week. She knew the channels, and the prairie sections, and the cypress bays. She knew where the stork colonies were, and where the gators were densest. and where the water hyacinth clogged the passages badly enough to make paddling impossible. She did not know until the spring of her 3rd year that someone had been building in there. She found it on a Thursday morning in late March, while pushing through a section of Cypress Bay she'd paddled through dozens of times before. The route took her through a passage barely wide enough for her kayak, flanked on both sides by cypress knees, and she almost didn't see it because it was built low and covered with cut vegetation that had been laid over the top of it deliberately. It was a platform, elevated above the waterline on wooden posts driven into the peat, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with boards laid across a frame of pressure-treated lumber. Not rough or temporary. The joinery was competent, the posts were leveled, the boards were evenly spaced, and had clearly been cut to length rather than laid on in whatever size they came. Someone who knew how to build things had built this. The vegetation cover on top was fresh enough to still be green in places. This was recent work. She stopped her kayak and sat there for a while, just looking at it. There was nothing on the platform. No equipment, no supplies, no personal items. Just the structure, just the boards. She photographed it with her field camera, noted the GPS coordinates, and kept moving. She found the second platform 2 days later. Different channel, different Cypress Bay, about 3 miles from the first. Same construction quality, same fresh vegetation cover, same absence of any materials on the surface. By the end of that week, she had found 4 of them, distributed across a roughly 2-mile section of the swamp, in an arrangement that, when she plotted the GPS coordinates on her map that evening in her truck, she recognized immediately. The 4 platforms were positioned in a rectangle. A large rectangle, almost perfectly proportioned, roughly half a mile on each side, with 1 platform at each corner. Like markers, like the corners of something being established, with a perimeter of driven posts connected by heavy gauge wire mesh that went from 6 inches below the waterline to about 4 feet above it, forming a rough oval perhaps 30 feet across. Inside the enclosure, there were fish, a large quantity of fish, including several species that are heavily regulated under federal and state wildlife law. This was a poaching operation, a sophisticated one, designed to use the depth of the refuge's cover and the platform network as a distribution and staging system. The enclosure was the holding facility, the platforms were the staging points, and the layout of the whole system had been designed so that no single element was close enough to any other to suggest the full picture, unless you mapped all of them together. The investigation was taken over by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Office of Law Enforcement. It continued for more than 4 months. I'm not going to get into the specifics of who was identified and charged, because several of those proceedings were still ongoing when this was reported, and some names were sealed pending further investigation. What I will tell you is what the investigators said about the scale and duration of the operation. The platforms showed weathering patterns and wear consistent with use over at least 2 years. The enclosure had sedimentation around the post bases, suggesting it had been in its current location for at least a full cycle of seasonal flooding, which meant it had been there through at minimum 1 complete year. This had been running in the middle of a federally protected wildlife refuge for somewhere between 2 and 3 years, before Adrian paddled through that cypress passage. She said afterward that the thing she couldn't shake was the vegetation cover on the platforms. The deliberateness of it. Someone had cut vegetation and laid it carefully over the boards, fresh enough that it was still green, specifically so that someone passing overhead, a survey plane, a refuge drone, wouldn't see the structures against the canopy. That level of thought, that level of attention to not being found. She paddled through that channel all the time. She'd been paddling through it for 3 years. She had been 3 years of proximity to something that had been carefully, specifically designed, so that she would pass right over it and never know. She said it made her think differently about the swamp, about how much it can hold inside itself without showing you. Story 3. 15 feet. Caddo Lake, Texas-Louisiana border. Caddo Lake sits on the border between East Texas and Northwest Louisiana. It's the only natural lake in Texas, and it doesn't look like a lake. It looks like a swamp, because it is one, essentially. Thousands of acres of bald cypress draped in Spanish moss, standing in water that's shallow in most places and dark the whole way down. The cypress trunks are enormous, old growth in many sections. and they stand so close together in the deeper parts of the lake that navigation without knowing the marked channels is a genuine navigational puzzle. Locals call the unmarked passages the back roads. You don't go down the back roads if you don't know them. Chris Alvarado was 24 years old. He and his older brother Marcus, 27, had been renting a cabin on the Texas side of the lake every fall for 3 years. A family tradition that had started when their father used to bring them as kids, and that they'd kept up on their own after he passed. They were comfortable on the water, but not expert. They knew the main channels, the boat ramp, the 2 or 3 areas where bass fishing was consistently good. They did not go down the back roads. On the second morning of their trip that year, Chris woke up early and decided to take the flat-bottom boat out alone while Marcus slept in. He wanted to get to a point on the east side of the lake before the sun was fully up, where the bass moved into the shallows in the early morning. He'd fished it the previous year and done well. He took a wrong channel. He knew he'd made a wrong turn almost immediately. The passage narrowed faster than it should have, and the cypress knees were closer to the surface than any marked channel would allow. But he had a good sense of where he was on the lake generally, and he thought he could push through to open water rather than backing the flat bottom out through a narrow passage. It would be faster to go forward than back. He pushed through for about 10 minutes. The channel tightened. The moss hung lower. The light got thin. Then he broke through into a small open section, not the lake proper, just a wider spot in the swamp, maybe 40 feet across, ringed by cypress on all sides. And on the far side of that clearing, tied to a cypress trunk by a length of rope, was a flat-bottom boat, older than his, green paint, most of it gone. And sitting in the boat facing him was a man. The man was old. Chris said 70 at least, maybe older. He was thin and long and still, seated in the rear of the boat with his hands on his knees, looking directly at Chris. He hadn't moved when Chris broke through into the clearing, hadn't reacted, just sat there and looked. Chris said good morning. His voice came out smaller than he expected in that tight space. The man didn't say anything. Chris said he thought he was turned around, asked if the man could point him back toward the main channel. The man looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up a paddle from the floor of his boat, leaned out over the water, and pointed it to Chris's left, not at a visible channel, just at a section of cypress and moss and shadow that looked the same as everything else around the perimeter of the clearing. Chris thanked him and started moving in that direction. And then the man spoke. He had a voice that Chris said was the kind of voice that's been roughed up by decades of weather and tobacco, low and flat, and carrying in the swamp air the way sound does over water. He said, "You didn't see the other boat." Chris stopped paddling. He looked back at the man. He said, "What other boat?" The man pointed again, this time behind Chris, back the way he'd come in. Chris turned and looked. 15 feet from where he'd entered the clearing, tied to a cypress knee with a short rope that kept it barely above the waterline, was a small aluminum boat. A John boat, maybe 10 feet. It was almost completely submerged, held just at the waterline by the rope, so that only the top few inches of the hull were visible above the surface. If you weren't looking for it, you would pass right over it without seeing it. Chris had passed right over it without seeing it. He looked at it for a moment. He looked back at the man. The man said, "Been there about a week." Chris said, "Is there someone in it?" The man said was. He said it the way you'd say it if you were describing something unremarkable, the way you'd say it if you wanted someone to understand something without having to explain it. Chris asked if he'd called the sheriff. The man looked at him steadily and said the sheriff's water patrol came through this part of the lake about once a month, and that Chris had enough time to make it back to the main channel if he started now. Chris left. He paddled out the way the man had pointed, which worked exactly as directed, and he was back at the cabin in 40 minutes. He woke Marcus. They drove to the Caddo Lake State Park Ranger Station together and reported what Chris had seen. The Cass County Sheriff's Office Water Patrol recovered the submerged boat that afternoon. The boat was registered to a 38-year-old man from Uncertain, Texas, the actual name of the nearest town, who had been reported missing by his wife 11 days earlier. He had told her he was going out on the lake for the day. His body was not in or near the boat at the time of recovery. The lake was dragged in that section over the following 3 days. His body was recovered on the 4th day, in a deeper pocket of the swamp about 200 yards from the submerged boat. The cause of death was ruled accidental drowning. The manner, how exactly a man ends up drowned with his boat submerged and just long enough to keep it from going all the way under, which is not what an anchor line does. He hasn't been back to Caddo Lake since. His brother goes without him now. Story 4. The Interior, Great Dismal Swamp, Virginia-North Carolina border. The Great Dismal Swamp doesn't have the prettiest name in American geography, but it's honest. It covers about 100,000 acres on the Virginia-North Carolina border, centered on Lake Drummond, a blackwater lake so dark and remote that it's been generating folklore for 300 years. The swamp was surveyed by George Washington, who thought it could be drained and farmed. He was wrong. The swamp had other ideas, as the swamp generally does. It's a national wildlife refuge now. It has a maintained trail system and a single road into the interior, and the part near the road is a pleasant enough place to birdwatch. But the interior, the sections away from the maintained corridors, is dense and wet and difficult, and the people who go into it are mostly serious birders, researchers, and hunters who know what they're getting into. Teresa Huang was a 30-year-old graduate student in ecology doing field research on invasive plants in the refugees' interior wetland sections. Her work required her to spend time in parts of the swamp well away from the maintained trails, documenting the spread of species like Japanese honeysuckle and Chinese privet into the native vegetation communities. She worked alone, which her advisor was not thrilled about, but which was practical given the nature of the surveys. Slow, methodical, requiring concentration. She was comfortable with it. She'd been doing fieldwork in remote areas for years. In late October of her first field season, she was working a section of the interior about 2 miles from the nearest access road, following a compass bearing through dense Atlantic white cedar growth, when she found a trail. Not a maintained trail, not a game trail either. Those are narrow and low and follow animal logic. This was a human trail, wide enough for a person to walk comfortably, cleared to head height, with the cut ends of branches on the margins that were old enough to have healed, but recent enough that the wood underneath was still clean. Someone had made this trail within the past year or two, and someone had maintained it, and it was clear of debris in a way that the surrounding swamp was not, which meant someone was still maintaining it. She followed it. She followed it because she was a researcher, and it was an anomaly in her study area, and she had GPS, and a satellite messenger, and it was 10 in the morning, and she made a judgment call that ended up being one of those judgment calls you examine carefully afterward. The trail ran for about 3/4 of a mile. She tracked it on her GPS, through increasingly dense cedar, and then into a section of open wetland bordered by a stand of mature bald cypress. And at the edge of the cypress stand, the trail ended at a structure. It was a building. Not a shack, not a lean-to, not a hunter's blind. A building, a single room, roughly 15 by 20 feet, constructed from dimensional lumber and roofed with metal sheeting. It had a door, hung on proper hinges, and 2 windows, both covered from the inside with what appeared to be black plastic sheeting. The exterior walls had been treated with something dark, linseed oil or dark paint, that had weathered into the wood and made the whole structure hard to see against the cypress trunks at any distance. It was effectively camouflaged, not by netting or by being built into a hillside, but simply by being built the right color in the right place. Teresa stood at the edge of the tree line and looked at it for a while. The door was closed. No smoke, no sound of a generator, no smell of food or fire. She walked to the door, knocked twice, and stood to the side of the doorframe. Nobody answered. She tried the handle. The door was unlocked. The interior was one room, a cot with military surplus blankets on it, made neatly, a folding table with a camp stove and a propane canister, a shelf unit on the far wall holding food, canned, dry goods organized by type, a 5-gallon water jug, a bucket in the corner that was serving as a latrine. On the folding table, beside the camp stove, was a notebook. She described it later as a standard composition notebook, black cover, the kind you buy in packs of 5. She opened it. The pages were dense with handwriting, not journals entries in any narrative sense, not personal reflection. Lists mainly. Dates and times in the left margin, and then observations in the right. What appeared to be vehicle descriptions, makes, colors, partial plate numbers. What appeared to be observations of people, physical descriptions, clothing, what they were carrying, what direction they were traveling, whether they were alone or in groups. Cross-referenced with locations she recognized from her own fieldwork, specific trailheads, the boat launch at Lake Drummond, the main access road and its intersection with the highway. Someone had been sitting in this building and then walking to observation points around the refuge and recording what they saw in that notebook. Not for a day, not for a week. The notebook was more than half full. Teresa closed the notebook, put it back where she found it, and left the building. She closed the door behind her. She walked back the full 3/4 of a mile to the access road without using the trail she'd arrived on. She went back through the brush parallel to it and drove to the refuge manager's office. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service law enforcement rangers who responded found the building exactly as she described it. They also found, when they widened their search, 2 additional structures on opposite sides of the same wetland section. Smaller, simpler, essentially just weatherproofed observation platforms, built at height in the canopy of large cypress trees, accessible by wooden rungs nailed into the trunks. One of them had a direct line of sight to a section of the main refuge road where it crossed a visible straightaway. The other had a sight line to the Lake Drummond boat launch. The investigation took several weeks, and I'm going to be honest with you about what it found, because what it found was ultimately inconclusive. The building had no identifying paperwork, no registered materials, no prints in the database that returned a clear hit. The notebook was retained and analyzed, and the vehicle descriptions and observations within it were run against incident reports, crimes, and surveillance watch lists in both Virginia and North Carolina. Some partial matches to vehicle descriptions in unrelated investigations. Nothing that closed a case. The individual who built and used the structure was never publicly identified. The federal investigation remained open. The structures were dismantled. What investigators told the refugee manager, and what the refugee manager eventually told Teresa in a conversation she described as deliberately vague, was that the location and the nature of the observation pattern in the notebook suggested someone who had been, in their words, doing reconnaissance. For what purpose, and at whose direction, they couldn't say publicly. Teresa said what disturbed her, in the weeks after the find, wasn't fear in any direct sense. She'd processed the danger of the situation and moved on from it. What she couldn't move on from was the intersection of it with her own work. The dates in that notebook covered most of her field season. The location descriptions included areas she'd been surveying. She went back through her own field notes and found dates and locations that lined up with entries in that notebook. She was in there too. She just didn't know which entries. She finished her field season in the Dismal Swamp. She published her invasive plant data. She got her degree. She now does most of her fieldwork in groups. Story 5. Miss Lottie's House. Manchac Swamp, Louisiana. Manchac Swamp sits between 2 lakes in southeast Louisiana, roughly 30 miles north of New Orleans. It's sometimes called the Haunted Swamp, which is a name that gets attached to places like this down in Louisiana. Places with a history layered thick enough that the locals stop trying to separate what's documented from what's passed down. There's a story about Manchac, a specific one, about a woman named Julia Brown, who lived in the swamp in the early 20th century, and who told her neighbors for years that when she died, she'd take the whole town with her. She died in 1915. That same day, a hurricane leveled the town of Frenier, which sat on the edge of the swamp. 300 people, one day. That's the famous Manchac story. That one gets told a lot. This one doesn't get told as much. In the late summer, 2 men, both commercial fishermen who worked the Manchac area and asked not to be named, so I'll call them Ray and Dennis, which are not their actual names, were running crab traps in the interior of the swamp. They knew this section well. They'd been working these waters for a combined total of more than 40 years. They knew every tree and every shallow spot and every submerged stump that could hold a boat if you weren't paying attention. They also knew, the way people who spend a lot of time in a place always know, which structures in the swamp were abandoned and where they were. There were several, old fishing camps built on stilts over the water. constructed back when families worked this swamp year-round and maintained small camps deep in the interior. Some of these camps had been maintained into recent years by descendants of the original builders. Others had been empty for decades, slowly losing the fight against rot and flood pulse, and the general indifference of the swamp to anything people make. There was one camp that Ray and Dennis both knew by the same name, Miss Lottie's house. Neither of them could tell you who Lottie was, or when the name had come from. It was just what that camp had always been called. It sat on a small raised section of land about 4 miles into the interior, elevated just enough to stay above the waterline in most years. A central structure with a covered porch over the water, built from cypress that had weathered to a silver gray, empty for as long as either of them could remember using that section of the swamp. On a morning in late August, they passed Miss Lottie's house at around 6:30, on their way to the trap line, and Dennis noticed that the porch boards looked different than they had the last time he'd been past. He said there was laundry on the porch railing. They slowed the boat. They came alongside carefully, the way you come alongside any unknown structure in the swamp, and looked. There was laundry on the railing, 2 shirts and a pair of work pants, hung to dry. Recent by the look of them, still showing moisture. There was a camp chair on the porch that hadn't been there before, and through the screenless window opening that faced the water, they could see that the interior had been cleaned out enough that the floor was visible. All the accumulated debris and rot of years of disuse had been removed. The door of the structure was open. They sat in their boat and looked at all of this, and didn't say anything for a minute. Then Ray called out. Called toward the door, toward whoever was inside. Nobody answered. They looked at each other. They kept moving. They ran their traps, came back through the same route in the early afternoon, and Miss Lottie's house was exactly as it had been. Laundry on the railing, chair on the porch, door open. They came back the next morning and the next. Each morning the camp was occupied, in the sense that the signs of habitation were present, but each time they came through, there was no one on the porch. No movement, no response to a call. On the 4th morning, a woman was sitting in the camp chair. She was elderly. Ray said he thought mid-70s, though it was hard to know for certain because she had the quality of someone who had spent most of her life outdoors. She was small and thin, with white hair cut short, wearing work clothes. She was sitting with her hands in her lap, looking at the water. Ray cut the motor. He said good morning. She looked at them. She had a very direct look, the kind that doesn't waste movement. She said good morning back. Dennis asked how she was getting on, the way you ask a person in a remote location how they're getting on. She said she was fine. Ray asked how long she'd been out here. He said it carefully, not accusatorially, just making conversation, the way people who work remote water make conversation with the occasional person they meet in it. She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, long enough. Ray asked if she needed anything, supplies, water, any kind of help. She said she had what she needed. Then she looked at both of them, one and then the other, and she said, "You boys run traps out past the 3rd bend." It wasn't a question. She knew where they worked. She'd been watching them pass. Ray said yes, they did. She said, "You want to stay on the main channel when you come through here." Ray said they always did. She said, "I know you do. I'm asking you to keep doing that." Then she picked up something from beside her chair. Ray said it looked like a book, and opened it in her lap and looked down at the pages. Conversation over. Ray started the motor and they moved. They didn't talk about it much on the way out. On the drive home, Dennis said he thought she was probably just an old woman who wanted to live in the swamp and be left alone, and Ray said he thought so too. But Ray also said, when he told this story much later, that the specific phrasing had stayed with him. Not stay away, not don't bother me, but stay on the main channel, which is a very particular thing to say. It's the kind of direction that implies an awareness of what's on the channels you're not supposed to take. It implies a geography in her head of what's out there and where. They reported the occupied structure to the St. John the Baptist Parish Sheriff's Office 3 days later. Not urgently, just as a note, the way you'd mention something to a deputy you knew at the gas station. The sheriff's office sent a water patrol deputy out the following week. He found the camp unoccupied, laundry still on the railing, chair on the porch, door still open. No one there. A search of the broader area found no one. The deputy left a notice on the door of the structure regarding illegal occupation of private property. The structure was on land whose ownership title was contested in the St. John Parish property records. It had passed through several hands, most of them deceased, and the current legal ownership was genuinely unclear. The deputy came back 10 days later. The notice was gone. The laundry was different. Same position on the railing, different clothes. The camp chair had been moved to a different position on the porch. He didn't find anyone that time either. Ray said the last time he passed the camp was about 3 weeks after the deputy's second visit. He was alone that day, running a short section of traps. He came past Miss Lottie's house in the early morning. The laundry was still on the railing. The chair was on the porch. The door was open. He didn't slow down. He kept his eyes on the channel ahead and gave the structure a wide berth and kept moving, the way she'd told them to. He said that felt like the right call. He said it still does. 5 stories, 5 swamps, 5 encounters that landed differently on the people who had them. Some that resolved into something explainable, some that didn't, and some that resolved into something that turned out to be more unsettling than the mystery was. The swamp doesn't give you much to hold on to. It's not like other wilderness, where there's a clear distinction between the path you're on and the place you're not. In a swamp, that line is blurry. The water doesn't know where the land is. The trees don't know which way is up. Sound does strange things. Distances collapse and expand without telling you. It's a place where ordinary rules of navigation, of visibility, of cause and effect, get soft around the edges. And people know this. The people who use swamps to disappear, to live in them, to work in them, to conduct whatever business they need to conduct in a place where no one is watching. They know this. The swamp is cover. It has always been cover. For the people who need it, that's exactly the point. The best piece of advice anyone who works in swamp country will give you is simple. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Not because swamps are haunted, or because there's some unknowable force at work, but because the feeling that something is wrong usually comes from something specific that your brain has clocked before your conscious mind has caught up. A sound that doesn't fit. A structure that shouldn't be there. A person who knows too much about your routine. Pay attention to that feeling. It's been right more often than the people on this list probably wish it had been. That's it for today. If you're new here, subscribe. I put these out every week. Be sure to also check out the Just Creepy podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And I'll see you in the next one.